very timely given that we're towards the end of the year. I cannot believe that this crazy year is about over, but we are nearly halfway through November. We've only got about a month and a half before we say hello to 2021. So let me ask you a question. What is the difference between a regular household light bulb and a military laser? Well, there are many things, but the thing that I want to really have us pay attention to is this word. In fact, if you're taking notes, just write down the word focus. Write down the word focus. You know, I looked it up. The most powerful laser that I could find to date is a laser that was invented by the Japanese, produced by the Japanese. It has 2,000 trillion watts. I want you to think about that. 2,000 trillion watts. Now, your average household light bulb has about 60 watts, and this laser has 2,000 trillion watts. Which, if you think about it, I mean, it blows the mind in terms of the intensity. But there are industrial lasers that literally can cut through steel. They are used to cut steel. That's how powerful they are. What's the difference? I mean, yes, the numbers are different. I mean, we're talking 2,000 trillion watts for that most powerful laser versus 60 watts. But really, what is the difference practically? And the word comes down to focus. It's that word focus. So one of the things that I just want us to make certain that we're paying attention to, that as we work to finish out this year and start the new year strong, is to make certain that we're focused on the right things. And right now, I believe that what we should be focused on is setting our intentions or our goals for the new year. And one of the best ways to make certain that we finish or that we start the new year strong is to make certain that we finish the current year strong. So as we continue the conversation, let me ask you this question. Why does a Rolls-Royce car cost $500,000 or more and a Toyota Corolla costs under $20,000? And there are many obvious answers, right? I mean, some of you are probably in your office or at your home shouting out or saying out the answers. Of course, a Rolls-Royce is, you know, it's a nicer car. They put nicer materials into it, right? It's a bigger car, so they have more materials in it. I mean, there are all sorts of answers, right? But if I offered you a Rolls-Royce or a Toyota, which one would you select? And I hope that every one of you, whether you like a Rolls-Royce or not, the brand, would say, well, I would choose the Rolls-Royce because you don't have to drive it. You could take it and sell it and take the money, right? But which one would you choose? Hopefully the answer is Rolls-Royce. Now, I guess my question for you is, why would you do that? Well, because at the end of the day, it is a nicer car. Whether, you know, it's the car that you would own or not, it is a nicer car. What makes a Rolls-Royce nicer than a Toyota? So I looked this up one time, and I want to ask you this question. How long do you think it takes to build an average Toyota Corolla? That's kind of, I guess, an oxymoron. It's redundant. An average Toyota Corolla, I think a Toyota Corolla is probably average, right? How long does it take? And the answer is it takes 13 hours to build a Toyota Corolla. And then I looked it up. How long does it take to build an average Rolls-Royce, if there is anything such as an average Rolls-Royce? And the answer was 6 months, approximately, give or take. And in some cases, more than that. So here you have one vehicle that takes 13 hours and another one that takes 6 months. And yet they both do the same thing ultimately, but they don't do it in the same way, obviously, because people in their right minds would not pay $500,000 or more for a vehicle that does the same thing ultimately as the Toyota Corolla. Well, what is the difference? Ultimately, why is it that someone would pay $500,000 or more for a Rolls-Royce versus just simply going out and buying an average car like the Toyota Corolla? And the answer is, of course, the standards by which that person lives, but also the standard by which the product is ultimately built. See, the reason that people are willing to pay $500,000 or more for a Rolls-Royce is because they're built to a different standard, and the customer has a different set of standards or expectations as it relates to that product. So the thing that I want to ask you is this: what are your standards? Right? And part of our standards are our expectations. What are your expectations? What are your expectations moving into the final 45 days or so of this year, 2020? And what are your expectations as it relates to 2021? And more specifically, what are your standards? See, if I were sitting down with any one of you and I asked the question, would you like to earn more money in 2021 than you did in 2020? And I got to believe that every one of you would say, yes, I would love to earn more money in the new year. My question for you is, how are you ultimately going to do that? See, if we don't change our standards, meaning our expectations, and then the things that we do on a daily basis, basically our level of conduct, the things that we do consistently, we're not going to get different outcomes. See, we're going to have to change what it is that we do. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take you through really what's called a 7-step program. It's a 7-step process to achieve a goal. One of the things that I know is that whatever goal it is that we have, that if we will take it through a process, or specifically a formula, just like Rolls-Royce does or Toyota does, that you're going to get a specific outcome. And what I would like for you is to give you a process or a formula that would allow you to achieve your goal, the Rolls-Royce goal or some other grand goal. See, the cool thing is you get to decide what your goal is. I'm not here to dictate it. But the question is, what process are we going to follow? See, the reason I want to cover this with you is this, that I firmly believe in formulas or process. And the reason I believe in formulas or process is because of this. Let me just give you an example. If I said 10 times 10, you would say what? 10 times 10 is 100. Yes, Marissa, thank you. It's 100. Now, the question is, April, Marissa, and others who answer the question, how did you know that? And of course, you know that because you understand the formula. You understand that there is a formula to get an answer, whether it's 5 times 5, 10 times 10, or 100 times 100. Or even if I said 5,662 times 7,750, could you come up with the answer? And of course, the answer is yes, you could. Marissa is saying no. Well, Marissa, you could, as long as I gave you the numbers again and you wrote them out and you did the thing. That's true. You couldn't get it quickly. That is true. You couldn't get it quickly. But isn't that interesting? The Rolls-Royce is not produced quickly. It takes 6 months, where it takes half a day for a Toyota. And yet, which one would you prefer? And I got to believe the answer is the Rolls-Royce. So one of the points is that anything that's worthwhile is going to take a little bit longer. But my message to you here, at least in this phase of the conversation, is that we have to make certain that we're following a process or a standard or a formula. The reason that Rolls-Royce gets $600,000 or $500,000 for a car or more is because they build their cars to a certain standard, or they follow a specific process or formula. And the formula that Toyota uses for the Corolla is different. Right? It's a different formula. Now, it's not to say that it's the wrong formula, but if we're looking to get a better outcome, if we're looking to sell the car for more, then we can all agree that Rolls-Royce has a better formula as it relates to getting more for a car. Bottom line. So what I want to do is I just want to give you a formula that you can use to setting goals and achieving them. I think it's important that we understand that setting goals and achieving them is really just a process, or it's a formula. And the cool thing, guys and gals, about a process or a formula specifically is that it provides for predictability and duplication of outcome. Think about that. A formula leads to the predictability and duplication of outcome. When I say 5 times 5, you can predict the answer. It's 25. Even if you don't have the answer memorized, if you apply the formula, use the formula correctly, it will every time, if you apply it correctly, every time without fail, it will give you the correct answer. The only variable in the formula is not so much the formula, it's in the person who's applying it, because sometimes we make mistakes, right? But what I want to do is just make certain that you have a formula that you can use. Now, before I get into this 7-step process for setting and achieving goals, I just want to share with you a story. I love world history, and I especially love history during the middle part of the 20th century, specifically the 30s and the 40s, the Great Depression leading up to World War II, and then really post World War II into the Cold War into the 60s. But one of my favorite stories is what happened in Japan. Now, of course, we all know that Japan, along with the Axis powers, lost World War II, and Japan lost at the hands of the United States when we dropped two atomic bombs, one on Nagasaki and the other on Hiroshima. Well, when Japan surrendered, their country was, of course, decimated because of the conventional war, and then, of course, the unconventional war with the two bombs. They had lost a significant amount of their male population. Their industry had been destroyed. Railroads, factories, and so forth had been bombed, destroyed, decimated. The country was a shell of what it was going into the war. Not only was the country, in terms of its physical capabilities, decimated, but also psychologically. And this was in 1944. Well, at the end of the 1940s, around 1950, the leaders of Japan decided that they were going to get focused on achieving a goal. So one of the things that they did, the private sector and government got together and decided that they were going to become the #1 producers of textiles, in other words, fabric, to make clothes, suits, and whatever, right? To make their country the #1 producer of textiles in the world. And I believe at the time, the #1 producer of textiles in the world was England. So they had this lofty goal of this small island nation that had just been decimated by a war, a very catastrophic war. They'd been humiliated. They had been beaten down physically as well as emotionally. And here they are just 4 or 5 years later, setting this goal of becoming the #1 producer of textiles in the world. And by the end of the 1950s, Japan had become the #1 producer of textiles in the world. What is interesting about that is they had just lost a war, a very humiliating defeat. And they got focused, despite those challenges of their industry being bombed, of a large portion of their male population being injured, maimed, wounded, killed, then deciding that they were going to become the #1 producer of textiles. That really doesn't matter what it was. They just decided they were going to become the #1 producer of textiles. But I just think it's fascinating that they had the presence of mind and the focus, the ability to transition from all of those challenges and those circumstances to they were going to become #1 at manufacturing something in the world that they had never become or never had been #1 at before. It speaks to what we're capable of if we'll just simply get focused. So at the end of the 1950s, they decided that they were going to get focused on something else. They decided that they were going to become the #1 producers of steel in the world, which that was a significant goal for an island nation. Let me just kind of paint a picture for you here. Just 15 years earlier, they had been decimated by the war. England and the United States, their economies had been ramped up and were churning and just absolutely raging because of all of the production of the war implements, the tanks and the trucks and the weaponry, everything that had to be produced, that those two economies were raging. They were doing very well. And all of the soldiers who came back from the war, of course, needed places to live. And so there was this real estate boom and everything related to real estate. So the economies were doing very well in both the United States and England as a general statement, especially compared to Japan. And the #1 and #2 producers of steel in the world were the United States and England. And here's this little island nation of Japan that 15 years before had been decimated in war by the United States and England and the Allied powers. And they decided that they were going to compete on a national or an international level against the United States and England in steel production. And what is interesting is, this is fascinating. Japan is an island nation. they have zero coal to speak of, and they have zero iron ore. Two things that are absolutely necessary for the production of steel. And yet they had the audacity to say that they were going to become the #1 producer of steel in the world, competing against the United States and England, these two superpowers. Well, by the end of the 1960s, guess who was the #1 producer of steel in the world? Yes, you got it. It was Japan. And what is interesting is that by the end of the 1960s, they had produced all of this steel, and they were selling it. They were selling it to England and the United States primarily. And they got this bright idea. They said, here we are producing all of this steel and sending it off to the United States in exchange for, the US dollar or gold, which is great. We're making a ton of money. We achieved our goal. But what would be cool is to do what the United States is doing with it. See, what they realized is the United States was buying all of this steel, and they were doing many things with it. But one of the primary things that they were doing with it was they were using it in the manufacture of automobiles. And so the private industry in Japan and the government got together and said, you know what, we're going to focus on manufacturing automobiles and becoming the #1 producer of automobiles in the world. Now, if any of you are old enough to remember what happened in the 1970s, I mean, they say timing is everything. Japan entered the world market in auto manufacture in the late 60s and the early 70s. In the early 70s, there was the oil embargo, the oil crisis, where gas prices shot up and there were lines. I remember there were cars lined up for blocks, people scrambling to get gas because there was a gas shortage. And enters Japan with these small cars that had great fuel efficiency. All right, so they had these cars in a market that had great fuel efficiency, and of course, guess what happened? Their sales skyrocketed. And what is interesting is by the end of the 1970s, when you look at growth, right, on a national and international level, Japan achieved their goal of becoming the #1 producer of automobiles. And in fact, they put so much pressure on the international market, and specifically in the United States on American auto manufacturers, that they nearly put Chrysler out of business. But for the United States government, Lee Iacocca working together and the United States government bailing out Chrysler, Chrysler wouldn't be around. And it was the pressure that Japan had put on the auto manufacturers. I find that fascinating, guys and gals. The reason I'm sharing these stories is because I get that this year has been very difficult for a lot of people. And yet I know a lot of people who have earned more this year, sold more real estate this year than they ever have. And yet for a lot of people, it's been a very difficult year, very difficult. But I look at what happened to Japan and the fact that they got focused. And they set these standards of what they were going to do and how they were going to behave. And time again, with textiles, with steel, with automobiles, they achieved their goals. And the story doesn't end there. By the end of the 1970s, they said, well, we've achieved this goal. We are this like 800-pound gorilla in auto manufacturing, right? What else could we do? Man, if we can do that, if we can conquer textiles and steel and automobiles, what else could we do? So they looked at where the world was headed and what was going on, and they decided to focus on electronics. And of course, if you take a look at, especially in the 1980s, the amount of electronics that were produced in Japan, they achieved their goal of becoming the #1 producer of electronics in the world. Guys and gals, my message to you is this. And we're going to go through those 7 steps, so hang with me here. The most important thing that we can do is to make certain that we focus on the right things and not let the story of the past affect our resolve to achieve whatever it is that we say that we want. See, if Japan had used their history and recent history as an excuse, everybody would have said, it's okay. We would get that they would limp along, that it would take them decades, if generations to recover. And yet they didn't wait. They got focused. And it didn't take generations. It didn't. Because simply they had the resolve, the focus. and they set the standards by which they were going to live, by which they were going to conduct themselves, both in the government sector, the private sector, and as people, as a nation. I think it's a great example of what is possible, despite the odds, despite what has happened, that if we just simply get focused and if we live by the right standards and we apply those standards consistently, that anything is possible. So you've got to be asking, well, John, what are the 7 steps? What is it? Well, let me share with you what they are. And please take notes on this, because one of the things that I want you to do is, as soon as possible, this week, if not today, is to sit down and to really work on how you want to finish this year, but more specifically, how you want to start and finish the new year, 2021. So the first thing that I want you to do is this. I want you to, step number 1 is I want you to identify a goal. Now, as we go through this process, one thing I want you to realize is this, that this process applies to not just your business goal or goals, but it also applies to your personal goals. So whether we're talking about maybe a relationship that you want to create, or a relationship that you want to improve, or relationships, or your health, your mental, physical, emotional, spiritual health, or your business, it doesn't matter. This works for any goal that you would have. So step number 1 would be to identify the goal. And a critical part of the process is to make certain that you write down the goal. Not only write down the goal, but be very specific about what that goal is. Be very specific. See, one of the things that I've done to make certain that I really know and understand my goal is to really see it, to feel it, to touch it, to breathe it. For example, right? If there's a car that I want, or if there is a house that I want, or if there's a vacation that I want, I do a lot of research on it. In fact, if it's a car, I will go down to the dealership long before I'm ever going to get the car, before I intend to get the car, right? Before I have the money to get the car, I will go down a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years before, and I will drive the car. I will experience the car. I will do research on the car as if I were going to buy the car today, or a house. You know, if I know that I want to live in a particular neighborhood, which I've done, I will go and I will do research on homes that are available in the neighborhood. I will go look at homes in that neighborhood. I will walk through the homes. I will connect with the homes in that area. I've done that, right? A vacation, get online and do the research, right? Watch videos, read reviews, look at pictures, connect to that thing that you want. So identify the goal with specificity. Get really clear about what it is, what it looks like, and write it down. Write down what it is specifically that you want. The second step is this, and this is a critical component. Just merely identifying the goal, what it is that we want, that is the first step to making that goal a reality. The second step to actually achieving the goal is to identify the date upon which we want to achieve the goal, that we'll have that thing, whatever it is, that will achieve that thing, that will accomplish that thing. See, identifying the date upon which there is a deadline where we achieve it, it starts to make it really real. See, most people will say, someday I'll have, or someday I'll get, or someday I'll be. Well, guys and gals, I looked at the map and I've never found someday I'll. It doesn't exist. Someday does not exist on the calendar. There's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, days 1 through 30, some months 31. You've got to specify. You got to be clear about what it is that you want and the date upon which you're going to achieve it. Because here's what I know. Life gets in the way. Just simply trying to survive gets in the way, and we forget oftentimes the life that we want to live, just simply trying to live the life that we currently have. See, I believe if we're going to live an extraordinary life, we have to be extraordinary. And one of the things that extraordinary people do is they get really clear about what it is that they want, and they identify deadlines to achieve those things, to have those things. So identify what it is that you want, and then the second step is to identify the date of achievement or accomplishment, and write it down. Writing it down is really a step towards a commitment to doing it. It's a conversation with yourself, taking it from the brain, from the verbal to the written. It starts to make it real. See, it's in your brain. I can't see it. I guess you can, but I can't see it. But if you write it down, not only can you see it, but so can other people. In other words, we start to transform it. We start to help it mature. We start to help it become a reality, at least more than just an idea. So step number 3 is this. Once we've identified the deadline, then we have to do this. And I want you to think about this. I'm going to ask you a question. If you were to think about this year and what held you back, all the things that got in the way of what you wanted to achieve, whether you achieved those things or not, but just what got in the way? What was it that you had to fight through? What were the things that tried to prevent you, or maybe in some cases did prevent you from getting what it was that you said that you wanted, achieving that New Year's goal, for example? In other words, step number 3 is to identify the challenges. Here's what I know. That if you say that you want to achieve something in 2021 that is better than, it's different than what you achieved in 2020, and yet you don't identify what got in the way in 2020, I guarantee you that the things that got in the way in 2020 will likely get in the way in 2021. If not those things and more. Because life is dynamic, it's unpredictable. And yet we know that there are certain things that consistently get in the way. So identify what those challenges are and write them down. Take this from a subconscious level to a conscious level to it's in written form. I can see it. I know what my challenges are going to be. In other words, we've got to anticipate. One of the best ways to be prepared for any challenge is to anticipate it. Anticipate what your challenges are going to be based upon your previous experiences. Now, for some of you, depending upon what the goal is, your challenge is not going to be the same as the person next to you, right? It's not going to be the same as other people in the business. It depends upon our experience, right? The number of years we've been in the business, what our typical challenges are. But what is important is that we identify those challenges. Now, the next step is this. Once we've identified what the challenges are, then we've got to take step number 4, which is to identify the solutions. I believe that one of the specific defining characteristics of people who are extraordinary, who achieve extraordinary things, is their ability to focus on solutions. Guys and gals, the average person, if you permit me to say this, losers specifically, they will focus on their challenges and they will bemoan the fact that they have all of these challenges. And for them, most of the time, in most cases, they will point to all the things externally that they don't have any control over and say it's because of these things that I can't have what I want or live the life that I want. That's just a loser's mentality. Guys and gals, what I want you to do is I want you to identify your challenges and identify the solutions to those challenges. The extraordinary person always focuses on solutions and does not focus on challenges. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't recognize the challenges. It just means that once you recognize them, you shift your focus from the problems, right, or challenges to the solutions. It is absolutely critical that we do that. So look, we've all had a long enough conversation about COVID and all the challenges, and we've been through an election process, and we've been through an economy that hit a major pothole or a bump, right? We've been in a market where inventories are low. I get it. All of that stuff has existed. Okay, those are challenges. Now it's time to shift from those challenges to the solutions to achieve what it is that we want. And you might say, well, John, I don't have a solution to COVID. You don't need a solution to COVID. What you need is a solution to achieve the things that you want in your life, regardless of whether COVID is around or not. Because so much of what is out there that we believe is impacting us isn't. And evidence of that is that there are people, your peers in this company, who are absolutely achieving more this year than they ever have. in the same market, in the same economy, in the same country. That has to do with a shift of focus and what they do on a daily basis. So I'm asking you, I'm begging you, I'm beseeching you. Yes, identify your challenges. In other words, see your world as it is, but don't see it worse than what it is. It is what it is. Now, the thing that I want you to do is this, and I want you to write this down. I think, in fact, write both of these things down. See things as they are and not worse than they are. See things as they are and not worse than they are. Really critical. Because, see, I think that's what Japan did. They saw things as they were, but they didn't see things worse than they were. Because if they had seen things worse than they were, they never would have taken the steps to actually achieve those 4 phenomenal goals. So, yes, be honest about the way things are, but don't see them worse than what they are. And then the second step is this. See things the way that you want them to be. See, that was the critical thing that Japan did. They cast a vision for themselves. This is what we want to achieve. This is the reality that we want to live. It is obvious that they did that. How do I know that? Because they achieved it. You don't achieve those significant goals like that with significant challenges without seeing very clearly what it looks like, what it feels like, what you would have to do. So see things as they are, not worse than they are, and then see things the way that you would like them to be. Identify your goal and write it down. Identify a deadline to achieve the goal and write it down. Identify the challenges to achieving that goal and write them down. And then identify the solutions to those challenges and write them down. And then step number 5 is to put together a plan. This is one of the most critical components of the process, is to write down what it is that you would have to do, not over the course of a year, but what you would have to do on a daily basis, those baby steps. Look, the pathway to success, guys and gals, is paved by individual bricks. 2021, the pathway to the end of that year, this coming new year, will be paved by individual days. So the critical component of your success in 2021 is going to be to identify, okay, what are the critical things that I need to be doing on a daily basis in order to achieve my goal? Now, if it's real estate and you want to sell more real estate, well, it's obvious you're going to need to do your job to a higher level. So identify, okay, what were my challenges in 2020 relative to doing my job, and what are the solutions to make certain that I'm doing my job to a higher level? And if you have any questions, okay, but what should I be doing on a daily basis? There shouldn't be questions, but I'm going to give them to you very quickly. It's prospect, talk to people every single day and identify when you're going to do it and for how long, a start time and a stop time. The second thing would be to identify when you're going to follow up with people, right? And those are 2 separate activities. Identifying when we're going to generate a lead versus when we're going to follow up with a lead. Talking to people is lead generation. Following up with people is lead conversion. We want to convert a lead to a client, a contract, or a buyer broker agreement where we're helping a buyer purchase homes or home. So identify what you're going to do. I'm going to prospect. I'm going to follow up with people. I'm going to set appointments. How many appointments are you going to set? Your standard should be 1 each day. Just having a standard of at least 1 appointment every day. That would be a great standard by which you can conduct yourself. That should be your plan. The daily plan is I prospect every day, I follow up with people every day at defined times, and then I set an appointment every day. In other words, I've set that intention. That is my focus. That is my standard. Remember, going back to Rolls-Royce, this is our focus. This is our standard. We're going to conduct ourselves by this formula, and as a result, we're going to get a higher set of of outcomes. So once we've identified that we're going to set an appointment a day, then we identify when we're going to go on appointments. One of the best things that we can do is to identify, okay, what days will I go on appointments and when will I go on appointments? In other words, create a formula by which we conduct ourselves in our business. Because remember, formulas give us predictability and duplication of outcome. So if you know what you're going to be doing and when you're going to be doing, it creates more predictability. That's the number one challenge that real estate agents have, is that there's so much uncertainty in the business. And they say, well, it's just the nature of the business. Well, no, it's not. Because you don't think there's uncertainty in medicine or in law or in other professions? I mean, think about it. Think about the unpredictability in medicine. People don't plan to get sick. They don't plan to get into accidents. And yet doctors and doctors' offices have predictability and duplication in their process. You don't call your dentist and say, I cracked my tooth, I'm coming in at 9 a.m., right? They say, well, let's take a look at the doctor's schedule and figure out when they can see you. And then they look and they say, well, the doctor can see you. She can see you tomorrow at noon or on Friday at 2 o'clock, which would be better for you. So identify when you're going to do certain things, including when you're going to meet with clients, predetermine that, and then work to get people to fit within that formula, within your standard, within your schedule. And then the last thing, of course, is going out and presenting to people, talking to sellers and talking to buyers. And then I guess I would add to that as well, just when you're going to do admin work. See, what most agents will do is they will take admin time and confuse it with prospecting time, with follow-up time, and they're mixing it all together. And because there's always admin to do and there's always other things to do, they tend to do those things versus actually getting to the things that are most important, which is to lead generate and lead convert. So put together a written plan of what it is specifically, those baby steps. How to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Identify what your key core activities are that are non-negotiable, that you know you're going to have to do every single day in order to achieve your goal. And write it out. And then the sixth step is this, and it's probably the most critical of all of these once you've identified the actual goal, is to identify why. Why do you want it? Why are you going to pay the high price to achieve this lofty goal, whatever the goal is? We're going to finish on this. There are only two primary emotions that control people: love and fear. I believe that the average person is controlled by fear. It is the extraordinary person, the person who lives a life of passion, who is controlled by love. See, the average person spends their life running away from their fears, saying that they want to live an extraordinary life, but never doing the things that are necessary to live that extraordinary life. What they do is they spend their days running from their fears, never putting themselves into situations that make them uncomfortable. That when they find themselves in places of discomfort, that they do their best to get out of those situations. Prospecting, for example. Is it an uncomfortable activity? Yes, it is. The average agent avoids it at all costs. Whatever they can do, they avoid it. And yet it's the extraordinary agent, the above average agent, the top producer, who, even though they have fear of prospecting, they do it because they have identified reasons that are more important than the fear of prospecting and getting away from it, that causes them to do the thing that they're afraid of. Make zero mistake about it, guys and gals. Top producers are afraid of prospecting. They are. They have fear like anybody else. They're human, just like you. And yet they engage in the activity consistently. Why? Because they have found reasons that are greater than the fear that is created when they prospect to do the prospecting. Yeah, Christine says prospecting is looking for gold. It is. It is the goal. We've got to identify why it is that we're going to pay the high price that the average person will not. The average person lives an average life because they allow fear to control. If a grizzly bear were chasing you, you don't care where you get as long as you get away from the grizzly bear. That's the way the average person lives. They don't care where they end up as long as they can avoid the fear. Whereas the extraordinary person doesn't do that. They identify specifically where they want to go, and they are attracted by, they are pulled by their longings, their desires, their passions. Guys and gals, identify your passions and connect those things to the business of real estate, realizing that if you live in real estate within the realm of these standards, doing the monotonous, tedious things, committing to doing your job, to prospecting, to following up, to setting appointments, to presenting to people consistently, to doing the admin at defined times, not just whenever, right? Doing those things that if you do that consistently, that you'll achieve what it is that you want. See, it's the extraordinary person that does the monotonous, tedious things where nobody queues up. There's nobody there watching, congratulating. Great job, awesome job that you're doing these monotonous, tedious things. No, that's not what motivates them. It's that they're really clear about the life that they want to live. They can see it. They can taste it. They can touch it. They can feel it. And they're committed to it. And it pulls them. They desire it. They long for it. It's real to them. And then the last thing is this, in the 7-step process, just write the word down, Nike, N-I-K-E, Nike. In other words, what? Just do it. Just do it. I've given you a 7-step process that if you will follow it, I promise you, follow this 7-step process with any goal that you have. And if you do it, I promise you, you'll achieve your goal. Just as Japan did, and just as so many other nations and peoples and individuals have done to achieve the life that they want to live. See, it isn't written anywhere that this won't work for you. That's not the question. The question is, will you work for it? It's about focus, ladies and gentlemen. It's about intensity. It's about intention. It's about the standards. It's about the formula. Applying the formula that gives predictability and duplication of outcome. Identifying what your schedule will be. Identifying what it is that you'll have to do on a daily basis that over time has the compound effect that after a week, after a month, after a quarter, you look at it and you say, I am well on my way to achieving the goal. 6 months into it, you look at it and you say, I am on track. And by the end of the year saying, not only did I achieve my goal, but I blew past it. See, I believe that's possible for every one of us if we just simply will identify what it's going to take. So guys and gals, I hope this has been helpful for you. I've enjoyed the conversation. Make certain that you're going through the 7-step process of identifying and achieving a goal because it works. I know that it does. All right, let's finish this up with some closing affirmations. Here we go. I succeed because I act on my goals. I'm an optimist. I like talking to new people. I know what is important to me. I remember people's names. I have a daily plan and I follow it. I am passionate about real estate. I know consistency is my greatest tool. I like asking